Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to UK Jewish Fundraising Now 5. This is the fifth of our live streams, our virtual conferences we've put together to support those who work in the Jewish charity sector through the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you so much for taking the time, your time to join us today. And it's amazing to have so many of you with us. Our aim is to build on the work that Simi and others have already done on the Jewish Community Charity Professionals Chat Facebook group, which is being a fantastic forum and resource for people to share and help each other out, and urge everybody to invite other people that they may know to join, and also to pass on information. Sim and I have realised that since the beginning of lockdown, the membership of the group has gone up 75%, so thank you for that. For those who don't know me, my name is Ben Morrison. I'm a fundraising consultant and I work across the UK charity sector. What we're going to look at today is a good topic, what your donors hope you are thinking. And we are privileged to have two very well known and respected speakers join us today. So there's plenty of time to ask questions and share your thoughts. So I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Simi, to say hi, see how you're doing, Simi, how things going, and to introduce the speakers. So over to you, Simi.
Hi, Ben. It's been a really interesting week in the news. It always seems to be that way at the moment. But this whole Dominic Cummings situation, I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but what I think is relevant for this call that's so interesting is people are desperately looking for authentic, honest leadership. And yeah, I shared in the group earlier today a letter from two of the head teachers of our Jewish schools about the honesty involved in the challenges that they face, but they are still hopeful that they will have great schools open to children when they need them. And I just thought that was so powerful after we've had this few days of craziness in the press. And I also think that today, having Kate and Amy with us, who I know well enough to know that they pride themselves on honesty in their relationships and integrity and authenticity in knowing exactly what their foundations are about and sticking to those principles. I just think it's very well timed that we're getting together today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Amy, the director of the Pears Foundation, who may introduce herself a little bit more in her role and other roles, but I think we're really keen to hear what she has to share with the group today. So thank you, Amy, and over to you.
Thank you, Simi, and thank you for inviting me. This is very strange, seeing so many lovely, friendly faces and all in a big wall and not being able to speak to any of you, but hello. And for those who don't know me, I'm director of the Pears Foundation, where I've been for the past 13 years, working alongside the Pears family. In a separate capacity, I'm also vice chair of the Miscarriage Association, which is at the opposite end of the scale. We're a tiny charity with no grants and no major donors, and almost all of our funds are raised through individual giving and events like the marathon. So I do know what it's like sitting on the governance board of a charity that's right in the thick of this at the moment as well. I'm absolutely not here to get credit for Pears, but I thought maybe a few words about our response will help give you an insight into what donors are thinking. And I also want to talk a bit about the wider national voluntary sector response and some of the resources that you could be tapping into. I'm going to draw a distinction here between individual high net worth donors and trusts and foundations that have the professional staff and the ability to enter into long-term relationships and think strategically, but will also ask for applications and paperwork and reporting. There's a lot in common between both groups, but I know they're not the same. And there aren't actually that many trusts and foundations like us and like WAL in the community. So that's the perspective I talk from. And it has a lot in common with the individual major donors and high net worths that you deal with, but there are some differences. Pears actually has a foot in both camps because we've got Trevor Pears as our full-time executive chair, but we also have the professional team, which I lead. The other thing that's really important to note about our response is we're not a Jewish foundation. We're rooted in Jewish values and in the Jewish identity of the Pears family, but our work is national and international. And I'm going to start there and say for a second that the Jewish community, I think, does, for good reasons, have a tendency to look inwards. And of course, your primary concern is your own organisation and the community. But we work with organisations that serve some of the most disadvantaged communities in the UK. And however bad things are for the Jewish community, it's so important that we don't forget to raise our heads and look outwards and acknowledge that this is a global and a national tragedy. And there are communities in the UK that have it so much worse and are without the incredible safety net that so many of you have been able to provide. So I'm not knocking any of what you're going through, and I'm not trying to minimise it, but we have to remember we're part of a wider national picture as well. And for us at Pairs, that's actually taken priority over the past few weeks because of the vulnerable communities that we support through organisations like the Trussell Trust, which runs the largest network of food banks, school home support that supports some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children in the UK, the Samaritans, the Carers Trust, the British Red Cross and Marie Curie. And actually, the very first thing we did back in March when everything started was to sign up to the London Funders Principles, which hopefully most of you have seen, and then sit down and actually think about how we apply them. They're all about flexibility, responsiveness, and trust. And we wrote to all of our grantees emphasising that we would be as flexible as possible. For us, that means waiving reporting requirements, forgiving deadlines and targets, and offering to unrestrict project funding, and just making sure our grantees knew that we were available if they wanted to talk to us. And many of the foundations I've spoken to have done this. For us, it's relatively consistent with the way we've always worked, but for some foundations, that's quite a big shift. And it's a move to models that rely far more on placing trust in grantee organisations. And it will be interesting to see if that results in longer term changes, and will funders come to see unrestricted funding as the rule rather than the exception. Our trustees have committed to spend more money this year and prioritise existing partners and core funding where possible. We've responded to some emergency appeals, and we also unilaterally gave over 1.5 million in unasked for grants to the organisations we fund that we felt supported the most vulnerable communities. I've been in a number of Zoom meetings and conversations with other trusts and foundations, and I thought it might be helpful for you to hear some of the themes that are emerging from these. The first is that we are absolutely not asking you for sympathy or to get the violins out or anything like that, but donors' income is uncertain. As you have worked out by now, their profits may be down, their investments may be down, and any good fundraiser needs to understand that context before they make an ask and have the emotional and social skills to appreciate that some donors will be able to be more generous right now and others will be more cautious right now. Another trend that's coming out of these conversations, and also a lot of the research into giving trends at the moment, is emergency donations versus loyalty to existing relationships. Many of us as funders are prioritising existing grantees, and one of the concerns I have is we know that in doing so we're leaving a big gap. So if you have a funder, a loyal funder that's going to stick by you, then great. If you're a newer organisation, or if your business model depended on you finding 25% of your income from new trusts and foundations this year, that's going to be difficult, and we're aware of that. I just wanted you to know that it hasn't escaped us, that we are part of that situation. The other piece coming out of the research is that new donations or people finding new causes tend to be COVID specific. But one of the trends I'm seeing is this kind of Captain Tom effect and this rise in popularity of the NHS as a form of charity giving. I think that is both wonderful and also a concern, because the current wave of love for the NHS is very much blurring the lines between charity and state provision. And I can see positives and negatives coming out of that, but a negative could be the voluntary sector almost being in competition with the public sector. Another issue coming out of the conversations is local versus global. Again, the research is showing that many donors are kind of looking in a more narrow way and thinking locally and nationally. So what does this mean for Israel and for international development charities? How much headspace is there? And also, where does the Jewish community fit into people's giving? Do they count that as their local? If we're looking kind of inwards and looking at very, very local, are people going to look to the Jewish community? And that's something we could probably do with more analysis on at some point. Might be one for JPR maybe. Short-term versus long-term is also an issue for donors. Do we spend now, or do we prioritise helping organisations rebuild and recover? Some organisations will be able to do both, but some funders won't. And this is complicated by two factors. The first is the government response, which but the government response is kind of being created on the hoof by them, so it's quite hard to keep up with a funding response. And also we can only really know with hindsight when this first phase is over and we move into more of a rebuild phase. Another question, I think this is more one for Kate to cover hopefully, is what do we think about reserves? You know, should organisations be spending their reserves? Do we punish organisations that have reserves and don't need money right now but may need it later? Or do we reward organisations that maybe need urgent support now because they didn't build up reserves? And that's something I think Kate can talk a bit more about. And also for us, another thing coming out of my calls is that rushing into action isn't always a good thing. And as funders, we're trying to be discriminating when we receive emergency appeals. One example of that is first few days of the crisis, every organisation pivoted very admirably quickly into delivering online resources for schools. But all of the research and all of the evidence shows that online resources and teaching are of limited outcome and benefit for children unless they are joined up to some very engaged teaching and very much part of the teacher's planning. So online resources on their own are not proven to make a huge amount of difference. So is that where we put our money, or do we stop and breathe and think, is this really necessary? I mentioned before that we gave to some emergency appeals and not others. The reason for that was because I think to your funders, there's a difference between an emergency appeal that says we're losing money and we need to raise more help, and we need money right now to serve our beneficiaries and enable us to respond to COVID-19. Donors are worried also about the idea of having to rescue organisations. So asking for emergency funds without a clear recovery plan is going to make them nervous. And I think the message there is don't avoid essential work you could be doing now out of fear for the future, but don't create work yourself just to justify your existence if it's not a priority right now. And think about why you exist as an organisation and let that guide you. And I've got a little quote here I thought I'd read out from Michael Moody, who is an academic in the States. And I think this just really says it all for me. He says, fundraising should never be undertaken simply to raise funds. It must serve the larger cause. Organisations come into existence for the purpose of responding to some facet of human or societal needs. The need or opportunity for service provides the organisation with a reason for being, as well as the right to design and execute programmes or strategies that respond to the need. The cause provides justification for intervention, and this provides justification for fundraising. I mean, I know that's kind of obvious, but I couldn't put it better, and that actually you don't exist to deliver a service, you exist because of the need or the problem that that service is a response to, and that should be what's guiding you when thinking about emergency appeals. On the plus side though, I think the Jewish community has incredible assets that I don't see other charities having. You've got loyal donors, and if your donors are staying loyal, you have more of them than most charities do. And in many cases, really well-connected trustees who can ask their peers for funds and are part of those networks. If there needs to be more collaboration, then we have a geographically concentrated community, and we already know who the organisations are that are going to need to collaborate to serve it better. So we've already kind of done some of the groundwork for that. But just to end, something I do see that really concerns me is a lack of engagement, I think, with the wider voluntary sector. I often hear the term Jewish communal professional, but I rarely hear the term voluntary sector professional. We're so lucky in the British voluntary sector to have these incredible umbrella organisations, and I'm just not sure how much the community engages with them, and I think we need to. Yes, when you're in those kind of networks, the people and the organisations you connect with won't understand the Jewish nuances of what you do or the cultural quirks of how you serve the Jewish community, but then you might not understand the nuances of running a literacy project in Bradford. So everyone's got areas that are unique to them, but you would be surprised by how much you have in common. And I think sometimes spaces with this space I can see is incredibly valuable, but there's also a value of space with your peers in non-Jewish charities, which can be extra safe because you're not sort of after the same smallish circle of donors, and you can actually speak very freely in those. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the resources that are available that hopefully you already know about. NCVO has fantastic information on its website, but it's also the voice of the sector to government. And if you want them to be representing your views and experiences, then you have to be part of that and give them your views and experiences. ACIVO, Association of Chief Execs of Voluntary Organisations. I've had some CEOs say to me, look, I'd love to join, but I just don't have the headspace right now. And my argument to that is I totally understand, but you have to fit your oxygen mask before you can help your team to do so. And I think they have done some fantastic support on webinars and an online community for CEOs. And for those of you who aren't chief executives, just to say, I don't think that's the kind of thing to be resentful of if you see that organizational money has been spent on your chief executive joining. I think it's something that will help them lead better. Association of Chairs, every single chair in the Jewish community should be a member of this. I feel really strongly about that because their fees are so low. It's completely affordable for all charities, and it upsets me when I see chairs not joining because I just think they're a fantastic organisation, and for the price they charge, you haven't really got that much to lose. Institute of Fundraising and CAF websites have some really interesting donor insight research on their websites, and they're putting all the recordings of their webinars up, and they are doing polling regularly to monitor the trends, which will be useful for all of you. For the fundraisers out there, University of Kent has made some of its MA materials free to look at on their MA in a Day page, or just buy a copy of The New Fundraisers by Beth Breeze, because anything she writes is good and useful. And for the non-fundraisers out there, the University of Kent is about to do a MOOC, I think it's called, a massive online open access course, starting at the beginning of June, called Fundraising for Non-Fundraisers. And I'll put the link up in the group afterwards, but would really urge you to sign up for that. It's a 3-week course, I think, with about 3 hours a week of work, but it should be really good. And it's led by the academics at Kent. And last but very much not least is my favourite one, IVAR, the Institute for Voluntary Action Research. They are one of the best organisations out there supporting the voluntary sector. And 2 things they're doing that I think are really important now is, first of all, they're running open sessions for senior leaders. So you just go online, sign up to a session, and they're facilitated conversations with senior leaders from other organisations to just talk about where you are, how you're doing, what the issues are. And they it's almost like an instant action learning set, and they're producing briefings of those, which they're feeding back to the funders in the sector, so that without badgering everyone for information, we can see what the trends are, what people are thinking, and get a broad overview of what people are, where people are. And the other one is, a couple of people have mentioned to me mergers, and IVAR have written a series of really good publications. They've got Thinking About Sustainability, Thinking About Core Funding, and one called Thinking About Mergers. And nobody who is thinking about mergers should not have read Thinking About Mergers, because it's really, really good. And it sets out all the things you need to think about, case studies, different options, as well as full mergers. So I'd really, if you are thinking that that might have to be an option for you, then do read it. And I spoke to Ben, the chief exec of IVAR, and they're actually going to be updating their blog and their webpage in the next couple of weeks with resources about thinking about a merger from a position of panic or weakness, or in these kind of circumstances. And I've spoken for too long, so I'm going to hand over to Kate, but I have got Ben to forward me his soon to be published blog, so if that would be useful, I can talk more about that in the Q&A.
I'm just going to, somebody's already messaged me, and I was going to say, if you missed any of those links or names, do not panic. Amy's going to put everything in the group, so please don't worry. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Ben and Simi. A huge thank you for inviting Amy and I here, but also a huge thank you to both for creating a group like this. I think in normal times, it's really important to learn from our peers. In these extraordinary times, it's even more extraordinary and even more important to do so. So thank you both for doing that. For those of you who know me, I'm the CEO of the Maurice Wall Charitable Foundation here in the UK. Many of you, like Amy said, it is like looking at a bank of friends here. There's something very lovely. The way that you've all constituted on my screen is a whole load of people that I know and I have known for the last 10 years. So it's a real pleasure to be talking to you all. What some of you may know about me is that I actually started my career as a project manager and then spent many years as a fundraiser, culminating in my role as campaign director at UJIA many years ago. So I have walked in some of your shoes and understand some of the issues. I also, in a lay leadership role, I am a trustee of a number of different trusts, but also of a number of organizations that are focused on Jewish communities in Europe. So like Amy, I am looking at this from different angles, and on any given day, maybe looking at it from a number of different angles. Before I begin, what I really would like to do is acknowledge and thank all of you, because you've kept the wheels of our community rolling over the last 10 weeks. And I think that's incredibly important. And what I would like to quickly do is really acknowledge and recognize some of the different sectors that have really done incredible work over the last few months. And obviously I'm going to start with the care sector. From the carers to the leaders, to all of you in the sector, you've shown extraordinary courage and fortitude. And we are incredibly grateful. The leadership have acted decisively and early to minimize loss of life on one hand, but you've also pivoted, those of you who are offering services, have pivoted fast to make sure that your client base have been able to access the services they have so deeply needed. To the education sector, again, a huge fast pivot online, notwithstanding Amy's comments on too many resources. I think both Amy and I would say that we credit the education sector, Pages and the Community Wellbeing Project, with really understanding very early on in the crisis that as important as getting resources out there was to acknowledge and to help the well-being of the parents and the children through this crisis. And our schools also took care of their vulnerable families. So again, I want to acknowledge and really to thank you. And to thank all those organizations that pivoted from their key operations to other operations that were deeply needed across the community and beyond the community. Ray happens to be front and center in my screen. So JW3 in terms of their food bank, but also a number of other organizations like Work Avenue who took on the hardship fund. To all of you who've continued your services in the face of adversity, a huge thank you. And to all of you individually who've continued to work when we haven't had ideal working situations at home. We've all been Zoom bombed by our children, our dogs, and many others. A huge, huge thank you and a debt of gratitude from all of us to all of you. Your tenacity really does make me feel positive about the future of our community. So Amy has spoken very much about what foundations signed up to, and we at WAL very similarly signed up to those. I'm always conscious, Amy and I share a friend in the States whose line is, when you know one foundation, you only know one foundation. So I'm very conscious that I speak to you very much from a WAL perspective, but I hope that there'll be some resonance across some of the things that I wanted to say. But like Amy, very much across the philanthropic sector, we've seen foundations confirming, and we have at WAL, confirming all of our outstanding pledges, being as flexible as possible with our current grants, simplifying our application process, working with other funders to try and simplify processes. For us, it won't surprise any of you to know due diligence is still very much at the heart and soul of what we do, I'm sorry. But that makes sure for us that we put resources where we feel resources are truly needed, and much of what Amy said absolutely resonates in terms of what is emergency funding. So I won't repeat that. So what do your donors hope you're thinking? Again, I'm going to speak for WAL, but hope that it resonates across the board, and I'll be happy to take questions. It won't surprise any of you who know me to know that I have two answers, not one. One is strategic and one is more operational or technical. It will surprise you to know that I'm going to take the technical operational first, which is not my normal route. And I do this because as a past fundraiser, I hope that this will speak to the fundraisers on the call and will be helpful. I always talk about, and many of you, again, I'm sorry if I repeat myself, many of you have heard me say that fundraisers need to be at the heart and soul of their organizations. You need to be working always at any moment very, very closely with your senior leadership team and with your trustees on where your organization is going. But I believe that now it is absolutely critical. We all know, you all know that cash is king. And we understand that at this moment, long-term planning is really very difficult unless we now consider 3 to 6 months long-term planning. But we would hope that you started to do some contingency planning. The if this happens, then that happens. And that you've started to put some financial thinking and planning around that. We've seen from organizations we've been working with that some people are working with best case scenarios, bad case scenarios, and then worst case scenarios. We would hope that you're doing some sensitivity checking around that. So we all know that the elderly care sector came out first with their campaign back in March. They had some contingency planning, some financial planning around it that they're now able to test against. So they made assumptions about beds and occupancy that now they can see. We're at the end of May. Were they right? Were they wrong? It's not really right and wrong. Were they too many, too few? And then can consider their forward planning appropriately. And then, of course, we hope that you're all taking, and I'm sure you are, every step possible to conserve cash, because cash is king at this moment. We hope that you've taken provisions to delay any payments that you can delay, to defer any non-essential programming or work that you may have chosen to do, and of course to renegotiate any contracts that are renegotiable. But we also hope that you've taken every step to bring in all monies that may be due to you, whether that's through services that you may have delivered and are waiting for funding from, or whether that is pledges, outstanding pledges. We hope that you've applied to any national or local funds that may be available for you, and that you've spoken to your banks. I told you I would be bombed by my dog. I am indeed being bombed by my dog. We hope that you will have increased bank loans and bank facilities accordingly. And then there's a thorny issue of reserves. Amy rightly said that I would address that. We hope, your donors hope, and I think this is true of all of your donors. At the beginning of this crisis, when we raised the issue of reserves with some of our grantees, the answer we got back was, but our reserves are here for a rainy day. We can't dip in. We have to protect our reserves. We would probably say that this is the rainy day. In fact, it may not even be pouring. There may be a massive thunderstorm out there. We just don't know. Nobody is suggesting that you wipe out your reserves, but I would say that we are, as a community, incredibly lucky with the reserves that we have. The majority of our grantees are sitting on 3 to 6 month reserves, and we know from the JLC report that some grantees are sitting on up to a year of reserves. Other grantees of ours in Israel may be sitting on 1 month's reserves and may not have been paid for services by government for the last 4 to 6 months due to there not being a government. Other of our grantees may have no reserves at all. So I think there has to be an honest and open conversation at board level, at senior leadership level, around reserves and use of your reserves. As Amy mentioned, we're not asking for any sympathy, but obviously we are an endowment, and our monies are tied up like your monies are tied up. So understanding and being able to communicate with your donors about liquid and illiquid reserves is very important at this point. And I think Amy mentioned some courses. If people don't feel that they are able to have those conversations with their donors, there are lots of courses online that you can access, and I think Amy's going to share some of those with you. So if I move to the strategic answer, and this is really a conversation with the CEOs, senior leadership teams, and board members. And I can see people on the call that I've already had these conversations with, so forgive me. But as we come out of this crisis and into what we all now consider to be a long-term financial crisis, life has clearly and unequivocally changed. The chances are we're not going back to where we were. And so we're considering the model protect, pivot, and thrive. And I would say that we're probably all in the protect part of this model, which is we're conserving our core. What we, your donors, are hoping is that you are having conversations, honest conversations around your strategic objectives. Not notional conversations, but true conversations. What is it you're trying to achieve and for whom? And if that's true, what are your core activities? What do your clients or your end users really need? And what happens if you don't offer those services? Where will they be picked up? Can they be picked up? Won't they be picked up? Where is the existential threat if some of your services disappear? And we were asked, with a different hat on, we were asked this question when we were raising money. One of my trustee roles is for Educating for Impact, where we work with 19 communities, small Jewish communities across Europe, through their Jewish schools. We were talking to an American donor who said that he didn't believe that Jewish schools, the loss of a Jewish school was an existential threat. And it made us sit back and reflect that for each of our 19 communities where there is one Jewish school, or maybe a very small number of very different Jewish schools for different populations, in each case, it was an existential threat to the continuity of that Jewish community if the school disappeared. So I ask you to consider that in your own organizations. Where's your existential threat? What is it you absolutely have to be delivering in these times? And then, of course, we'd ask you to align your resources and forecast your needs. When we move from protect to pivot, and we're beginning to see this with our Israeli grantees, who of course have come out of lockdown and are sitting and are beginning to return to a normal of sorts, we hope that you will be learning from this crisis, and you'll be looking at what you have learned. What are your takeaways? What do you now need to provide that you may not have provided? What may you have provided before that you realize that you don't need to provide? So in a conversation late last week with an Israeli grantee, they were reflecting on the fact that for many, many years, they have provided a service to vulnerable people across the periphery of Israel. And they've provided this service by inviting them into community centers all across the country. The realization for them is that they have been able to provide the same service more efficiently and with better results online than they have through community centers over many years. That is a huge learning and something that they will now have to tackle going forward and create their planning. Winston Churchill apparently said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." So I think as we think through some humor through this, let's not let a good crisis go to waste. On a more technical point, somebody actually sitting on this call told me that they were able to achieve with a 1-hour Zoom call from somebody, a well-considered speaker from Israel, they were able to achieve the same results as a 3-day speaker tour. Think of the savings there. And then what we all hope to do, pivot to thrive. So whilst we hope that you're protecting and conserving your core, what we really need to see will be the creativity, the ingenuity, and the collaboration that you have all shown in the emergency stages of this crisis. We hope that you will ruthlessly pursue your strategic objectives, but that you'll be willing and be open to every opportunity, seek to invest and expand where possible, and look at possible new collaborations and cooperations, things that you didn't imagine. So the same organization that I told you about offering activities through community centers also recognized through the crisis that there was another organization, not a competitor, but an organization that was entirely complementary, with whom they will now be running services to great savings for both. So again, open to all opportunities as we move forward. So in a very weird way and counterintuitively, I am really optimistic about the future of our community. We may not, and surely we will not, come out of this the same way as we went in. But we've proven that we're resilient, we're adaptable, and there is some great talent out there. So I have great optimism. But we do have to deal with the current reality. And there is no doubt that we're all in for a rocky ride. Money's short and cash is king. So what I hope is that you're all really considering your strategic objectives, you're aligning your programming. Please don't shore up your reserves at this moment, and be honest and transparent with your donors, because nobody expects you to have all the answers.
Thank you, Kate. One thing that I wanted to ask before Ben opens up to everybody else, and please, if you want to write any questions, do. Otherwise, please raise your hand and Ben will come to you. I just wondered if, for both of you, if Kate and Amy, if you had heard any assumptions being made by fundraisers or CEOs at this point that you wanted to debunk at all, if there's any common assumptions being made when people talk to you as funders.
We're both silent. Amy, this is unusual. Amy, you.
Is that working?
Yes.
I mean, not really, because we tend to have quite individualistic we're a relational funder, so we tend to have quite individualistic relationships with the organisations we talk to, and in some cases it's the CEO in general that we're talking to about the big picture. I think that the only assumption that we have seen is that one I mentioned around the emergency is simply the fact that this is happening and that you've lost some income, and that yes, well, we know, you know, we're not completely insensitive to that. We see that and we know it, but the assumption that that's enough to make a funder give an emergency grant, it's just not the case. But I mentioned that when I spoke.
I would agree with that.
Okay, so before Ben opens up to everybody, one caveat that I have to mention is that Kate and Amy are not seeing this call as a wonderful backdoor opportunity for people to pitch for emergency funding at this point. They've both already said they're supporting current grantees, and I'd really hope that people can respect that as we continue the conversation. So with that said, over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Simi. Thank you. As you said that, the smiles lit up my face, my screen, which was quite nice. So, and no one's left, which is great, which is even better, because I thought, right, this is the opportunity. Okay, guys, if you'd like to ask a question to either, or just want to share something else with the group that might be useful, if you can do the wave little thing on your screen, then I will come and get to you. If you go down to reactions and you do a little clappy thing, then, or there's the raise hand as well, then I will be able to somehow moderate this. If not, we've got one from Adam Ognall straight away, if that's okay, Adam. So let me, over to you, Adam.
This is fantastic. Hi, Kate and Amy. I'm going to resist saying so many things and stick with a question, which is about your experience and your expectations with your grantees, with your partner organisations who are not on the front line. So I work in the space of human rights, and there's a human rights crisis underlying the coronavirus crisis. And it's obviously not at the level of care homes and everything else. And you both used the word sensitivity. Do you have any advice for those of us who are maybe half a step removed from the immediate crisis as to sort of what are you finding to be appropriate responses? How are you expecting organizations and individuals to act responsibly so that they're not elbowing their way to the front of a queue ahead of, say, a care home? I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that. And I say that not just from the NIF point, because we sit in a funny situation where on some levels we are actually deeply involved in terms of our work in Israel on that immediate response for very vulnerable communities. But on the other hand, we have longer term work that's emerging. And so I'm just very, very interested to hear your perspectives as funders, as not just what would you expect from grantees, because that's a bit of a trite question, but actually, is there emerging thinking about these organizations who are maybe half or one step removed from the immediate crisis?
So I'm happy to answer that. I've been very struck actually by what I would call the maturity of our sector, of the Jewish sector, in terms of people, of the understanding that the care sector had to come first. And in fact, please forgive me if I've already said this, but I sit in a group of international Jewish funders who fund in Europe. And I was reporting to them, a similar call to this, reporting on what is going on in Europe and actually in the UK. And when I explained that organizations had stepped back to allow the care sector to respond first, or to get their applications out first, I could see the jaws of the Americans literally drop on the screen. They couldn't believe the maturity of our sector. And I think Amy and I have spoken about this before with a couple of our colleagues. We all see this in waves, Adam. So, you know, for us who fund, we have different foundations that deal with different parts. We're a group of 3 foundations, 2 of which sit in the UK. The Maurice Wall Charitable Foundation, as you all know, funds are UK based, whereas our Maurice and Vivian Wall Philanthropic Foundation funds in Europe and Israel. It's waves. Here in the UK, we see it as, we saw it as care first and then moving sector by sector. Some of your donors, Adam, and you and I know from other hats, some of your donors hopefully will have the human rights piece in their first wave. And I think you have to go back to your donors, your most loyal donors, and ask them to view you as frontline. You know, unfortunately, we've all had to make difficult decisions. We had a board meeting scheduled for the 16th of March, which was just a couple of days before lockdown, which turned into a very different conversation. You know, we had a lot of stuff on the agenda, but actually the agenda turned into, okay, well, what is our first priority going to be? How are we going to address this? And I'm going to assume that most foundations have gone through this process, and many major donors are going to be going through this process. So I think at this moment, the only comfort we can give you is for each of you to go back to your most loyal donors and to talk to them first, and to hope that as each wave of the crisis unfolds, that you're in whatever that next wave deems to be. I think we're all in unknown territory here.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The only 2 things I'd add to that is certainly trusts and foundations. We're here for the long term. It's not a sprint. We're not trying to sort of chuck a load of money out and then go, oh, job done, we solved COVID. You know, we're here for the long term, and we know this is a long term piece. So, for example, the organisations we fund that work in the education sector, schools have been closed, the museums, you know, those kind of things, they're closed. There's nothing we can do to help them right now. But we know that we'll be here for them when they do need to have those conversations with us. And the other piece I'd add is that giving is about values. And so far, I think it probably will change as we move into that awful kind of recession redundancies territory. But so far, the evidence is that giving is holding. And if your donors are giving because of a values proposition that you offer to them, then their values, we know that the thing that is least likely to change is values. So, you know, British people as a whole are very generous, might be giving extra into emergency causes, but there's no evidence so far that means they won't be giving to the causes they always cared about. So, as Kate said, it's just about starting with those stakeholders who are already brought in. And this probably isn't the time to go looking for brand new donors, but that won't be the case for always. It's just right now, start with the ones that are strongest.
Adam, I would also add that Opinium did some polling recently, and they found that the top 5 causes that people have supported since the pandemic, and I think that they didn't include the Captain Tom in this because that would have somewhat skewed things, but animal charities have been donated to more than mental health or homelessness or hospital. And that tells you something, hopefully in a good way, for charities that are not considering themselves as frontline right now, that if people believe in what you're offering, just as has already been said, you shouldn't be afraid to go back to the people with a really clear reason as to why you need money right now.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. We have a question. We have a hand raised, Arieh from UJS. We just find Arieh. Unmute. There we go. Okay, Arieh, are you there? Are you there? Is he unmuted? Arieh, you've got your hand up and I'm trying to unmute you. There we go. But I can't unmute you. So unless you can unmute yourself, there we go. Are you on? Arieh from UJS? No? Okay. I'll have to come back, or maybe if you would like to type in the question. Have we got anybody else that would like to ask a question, if you'd like to?
Can you hear me now?
There we go, yes.
Sorry, my Zoom decided to take that moment to crash, which is slightly inconvenient. Thank you, Ben, for the opportunity to ask, and thank you both for giving us this opportunity to hear from you. One thing that we are concerned about, and are always concerned about, but more so at this time, is the attraction of project-based funding versus core budget. and actually the increased need for core budget versus project-based funding. And I wondered if you had, either individually or in your conversations with others, whether there had been a conversation around the willingness or desire to fund core operating budget of organisations versus project-specific budget.
So this is an interesting one for us because overwhelmingly we give core, and where we give project, it's not because we've sought to stick our name on a project, it's because we've been asked to do, we have one organisation, Trussell Trust, the food bank organisation, we have actually given money for a project and we called them and said, do you want us to unrestrict it? It's $1 million over 5 years. And they said, no, this is a really important project. We need to get this done. And if the money's unrestricted, it will never happen. So we do tend to give in core. What I'm hearing in the UK national trusts and foundations is a lot more unrestricted giving, but something that we feel really strongly about at Pairs, that was actually a conversation that we were trying to sort of broker with NCVO before all of this kicked off, was that if you value core funding, then you have to show that you value it. You have to not only be asking donors for it, but you have to be acknowledging core funding when you get it. Now, everyone thinks when a donor says that, it's because we're all driven by ego and we want thanks. No, it's nothing to do with that. It's because if you're trying to show that core funding and trust in you as the organisation is important, then acknowledge it on your website. Show when you get it. Hold it up as a form of giving worth having and that's appreciated. Otherwise donors don't know. And something we have often found in the past, and I'm not talking about now, this is long-term COVID emergency, we just do not care whether our logo's on it or not. So I'm really not talking about now, but very often, and this doesn't apply to Pairs again, but a donor who gives £5,000 to a project gets their name on it and gets a nice little news story and a page on your website, and the donor that gives £50,000 annually core does not get that. If they're lucky, might get a tiny mention in your annual account. So I think donors are pivoting to core. I hope that it will hold. It's an act of huge trust in the organisations, and you need to repay that trust by being as honest and open about the challenges you're facing as possible. But you also need to think about how you will show that that core funding is valued and appreciated.
Okay.
Ari, I think, yep, Ari, I think what I would add to that is it may seem like a lot of foundations fund projects, but like Amy, we work very closely with the organizations, and often it's part core, part project. A project doesn't run unless you've got your core funding. And I think, I would hope that a lot of the people sitting around this table, this room, this Zoom call, would agree that as you build your relationship with your donor, then a lot of that is in the conversation that you have. And I think that there is certainly conversations happening more and more around the need to protect core funding in organizations. It's not always possible when you have foundations with groups with trustees who all pull in different directions. It's not always as possible to be as clear as Amy has been, but certainly there is an absolute understanding that an organization needs to run.
Okay, thank you both for the answer to that. Actually, Ari's connection crashed in the middle of it, but in good job that we're recording this so we can let him listen to the answer. But that's what this happens. Okay, anybody else got a question, would like to raise their hand or wishes to share something or pose a question? Just looking through the banks of people here. Yeah, I see Liz Jessel. So you'd like to just mention, Liz, where I know where you work, but the other people that don't know where you work, I just want to mention that, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Hi both. Thank you so much for your time. It's really interesting to hear your perspectives. I was particularly reassured about both your views on charities with reserves, because what you're both saying is almost contradictory to our experience. So Jamie has invested a huge amount of time in reacting and responding to some of the emergency funds that the government keep announcing on a regular basis. The mental health pot in particularly, that we were promised would only take us an hour to fill in, had a 28-page set of guidance notes before you even got stuck into the application form. And the very first set of criteria specifically said that they're prioritising organisations that don't have a comfortable level of reserves, which to us felt quite upsetting as a well-established organisation that worked really hard to make sure that we can maintain service. And you know, as you were both saying, if not now, when? What are the reserves for? If this isn't the biggest rainy day ever, then I don't know what is. So I just wondered if you know, you've obviously shared your own perspectives, but what the impact of this long term is if big funders, particularly government-fed funders, are going to prioritise those organisations or even prop up those organisations that were most at risk of falling over first when a crisis hits.
I think this is a really tough one, Liz. You know, Amy and I, some others have spoken long and hard about this. No, you know, none of us want to punish those with reserves, yet we are conscious that there are some without reserves. There's no easy answer. We're all working through, this is some of the unprecedented stuff that we're all trying to work through together. You know, we as a foundation and as professionals in a foundation, we want honest and open conversations. What we don't want to hear is our reserves are untouchable. What we do want to hear is that we honestly believe that we must keep whatever reserves, but we are willing to dip in because this is the rainy day. You know, you could turn around and say that our entire foundation is reserves. We're an endowment supposedly with the notion of in perpetuity. And so therefore we have liquid and illiquid assets, much like all of you. So it's a very difficult conversation. I'm hugely respectful of the grantees that we've spoken to date who have said, we're having these discussions around our board, we're trying to figure this one out. And that's the most we can ask at this point.
Yeah, I think it's also worth, I mean, our closest comparison to this is the last recession. And I think there's different reasons why organizations have the reserves that they have. And sometimes, especially for newer organizations or organizations that have been through major change, it just isn't possible to build up that level. But there are also organizations, and I'm not talking about anyone necessarily on this call or not, there are also organizations where there are deeper dysfunctions and that not having enough reserves is part of that. And those organizations are the weaker ones. And I don't think, you know, whatever government grants they get, if there are deeper structural weaknesses, they're not going to be the ones that survive this, because we see that every time when there are periods of crisis in the voluntary sector. So I think, as Kate says, we just want to know that this is being raised at board level and that you are having sensible discussions and coming to a sensible position on it. And it's not enough just to say, well, you know, we're not spending them because things could get worse.
Okay, right. I think we have Raymond, JW3, raise your hand.
Hi, thank you. I just want to add to that and just ask Amy and Kate if you're able to comment, and if you're not, that's also fine. In your conversations with other trusts and foundations, can you give us any confidence that there is an understanding that those of us, and I run an organisation like this, that have managed a sensible, healthy and robust reserves policy, and ours is 6 months as advised, and we have been every single week dipping into that. That's you know, our income is bound by at least 50% because of all of our earned income, which stopped when the doors closed, plus the unknown decline in our fundraised income after cancelling a number of fundraised events. So we are doing that, and that's exactly what it's for. We said very early on, rainy day policy. But we have no chance, I'm being very clear here, of building that back up to 6 months. We have no chance without someone saying here's a significant amount. So we will go into next year, when we start moving back to some kind of whatever normal becomes, with a severely depleted reserve that we have really no chance of building back up. And that means the next rainy day that comes, and in all likelihood, we have to all think that there will be more rainy days now like this, we are in more danger. And I wanted to know if you think that in the general conversations you're having with other trusts and foundations, that is something that is understood, and whilst emergency funding goes maybe to those who have no reserves, there is thinking about in 6 months and in 9 months what organisations can do and what they might need to avoid just being hit in a year's time.
So the major, really good point, and the major UK foundations that I sit in forums with are deeply conscious of this and quite frankly have spent hours agonizing over it. Paul Hamlyn Foundation is an interesting example. They're saying to their grantees, and you know, this is their position, don't spend your reserves. Well, I'll happily give you core now because we know that you're going to need them. So funders have different positions on this. I think, first of all, the norm is going to change. 6 months is not going to be the norm of reserves now. It could be years before we build back up to that stage, and your funders recognise that and appreciate that. So that yardstick by which reserves were only ever a proxy for thinking about the health of an organisation, and no organisation in the sector is going to have that position for the time being. But we know that, you know, that part of the problem of what's happening now, it weakens the whole fabric of the sector in general, because it puts us in a slightly less strong position for the next crisis and the one after that. So we're deeply aware of that, and funders are in the same situation with their own assets and finances. But I mean, there's not much more I can say other than this. This is the kind of thing that funders agonise over on a regular basis. And I know that doesn't solve the problem for you, but it might make you feel better to know that we all feel really bad about it.
Okay, thank you for the question. We've got time for a couple more questions, or people wish to share. Wave your hand in the air. If there are any. Here we go. We've got. I'm just seeing if there's any more questions that are coming up on the chat. People are sharing resources on the chat, which is great. Just talking about 2 Facebook groups that if you're not members of, I'd recommend them. Facebook chat, 15,000 people on there, but that's a really great way to get out of the Jewish community bubble, and to see some really great fundraising work going on that perhaps the community isn't aware of, or perhaps wouldn't think might be relevant. And the second one is Anna. Hi, Anna. Has mentioned about the major donor fundraising group, and there's also one called Trust Fundraising Hub as well. And Ali, thank you for that digital fundraising chat. So the fundraisers are definitely well represented on there, but as Amy was saying, there's so much out there for fundraisers and those involved in running charitable organisations to access. It's good to go out of the bubble. So any more raised hands on the screen here on my bingo card of faces? We have got a full house today, which is great. If not, I wondered, Kate.
Ben, I can see that Ellie typed a question, Ellie Ovitz, saying, are there efforts to encourage, facilitate mergers or resource partnerships?
Right. There we go. So I'll, if I can expand on that as well. I think I would say that there's been some unprecedented collaboration going on in the Jewish community, and it goes further than, you know, just logos at the bottom of a website so you can see which organizations are involved. And perhaps professionals, people who work in Jewish charities, are maybe up for more partnership working than sometimes perhaps their trustees or lay leaders. But I'd like to ask you both about what you've seen and what you've heard regarding this.
You go first, Kate, and then I'll...
Well, I was going to say, there are always conversations going on. There are always, as Ben said, there are always professionals who are talking to one another before COVID, and it will continue during COVID, and I suspect there will be more as a result of this. I'm not aware of any central thinking at this moment, but I suspect as we move forward, as I said earlier, there will be different cooperations, there'll be different ways of cooperating, there'll be different ways of complementing one another and recognizing that that works together. So for example, when you put your clients at the center, and there may be different resources for different clients, it actually could both be one resource. There'll be different ways of addressing problems. We need that creativity to really come to the fore. Whether that will end up in mergers, we all know how challenging that is. It may not, but it might end up in some kind of, I would hope it would end up in better services, more efficient services. Who knows? Who knows? I think we should watch this space.
Yeah, I think that the best resource for a merger is you. the organisations. That I think I never a fan of people saying, you know, could we just have one organisation? It's not a monopoly board. We don't sit there going, you and you and you should merge. And then that would say it's just not how it works. And that for a merger to be successful, it has to come, the will to do it and the efforts to do it have to come from the organisations that want to merge. The big issue at the moment is one of the things we know about mergers is the factor most likely to make them successful is when they're entered into out of mutual strategic choice. And at the moment, we're in a position where they're being entered into out of necessity. And that's the challenge. And as I say, I'll post in a few days when Ben puts up his blog, but a couple of his points were that it's still really important to identify a positive agenda about collaboration and merger. The agenda shouldn't be, we just have to because we've got no choice now, we'll all close. However desperate the situation, you need to feel a fit with your potential partners. You cannot force it together and it won't serve your beneficiaries if you do. And it may be more responsible to close down rather than compete with each other or struggle over a merger that just isn't going to happen. It will still be really important to articulate what your deal breakers are, what you're prepared to give up, what you're not prepared to give up, and to think about leadership. But ultimately it's driven by the beneficiaries and the organizations themselves. And if there is a real need and will to merge, then the last piece of the puzzle that fits into place is approaching a funder and saying we're going to need some extra resource to do it. But it's not just a cop-out. I think mergers don't work if we as the funders try and enforce them. They have to come from you. And I'll put, as I say, anyone thinking about collaboration, merger, anything like that needs to read the IVAR document because everything it says holds true even in a time like this.
Thank you. That's very, very, very interesting as you say that. I just want to go over just to Rafi Bloom, who just wanted to mention something about this, if that's okay. I'll just unmute you now, Rafi. I'm trying to unmute you. Maybe you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Myself. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you again from myself for this really interesting talk. I think I'm the only Northern representative on this call, so I don't know what that says about Manchester. But anyway, first of all, also thank you very much to both of you because as the Fed was part of the Jewish Homes Emergency Appeal, obviously we were very grateful for the help that we received from both of you and many other donors and trusts and foundations. It was really critical for us, and we actually did plan ahead with our residency and our occupancy. And I think from the care side of our operation, that was really, really important to do. Obviously, we have another side, our care in the community, and we help 1 in 8 Jewish homes now in Manchester we support, which is quite a staggering statistic. That's increased from 1 in 10. And one of the things that we found is there's been a weekly call with all the Jewish communal organisations who operate on the front line in Manchester, including Haredi organisations, religious organisations, reform organisations, welfare organisations, and it's been absolutely incredible in terms of collaboration, and it is really the way forward. One of the things that's come out of that, for example, is that the Fed and the Herschel Weiss Centre, which is a Haredi centre on Northumberland Street in the heart of Broughton Park, are going to both operate as the front desk for the L'chaim Food Bank. So we will take their inquiries because they are being inundated, and we will filter them, and out of that will also come the ability to help people who have other issues apart from needing food, but who've come to us because of food. And I think if that's something that organisations can look to do, where you have an organisation like ours that has the infrastructure to handle phone calls, handle referrals, and can do that for a small organisation which doesn't have a resource and is really sort of operating in a way by the seat of their pants, but providing a really important service, I think that's a really good way to use collaboration in the future.
Okay, thank you for that, Rafi. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for all of your questions and texts, and we're going to put the links up in the Facebook group. Over to Simi.
Just wanted to say thank you, Kate, Amy. It's been open, honest, and informative as ever. I think I've seen a lot of smiles during what must be very difficult thoughts and discussions that people must be having. So thank you for bringing some light into these difficult conversations. I know that full disclosure, Kate actually mentors me in the community, and having Kate as a mentor and Amy as a peer who I also lean on in that way has helped me get through this. And I would just like to make a call for everybody before we go that if you don't have mentors, regardless of where you're at in your career, I would suggest that now is a fabulous time to make sure that you do that. So thank you both for joining the call today and for your openness with everybody. And thank you for what your foundations are doing.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
See you in 2 weeks' time. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.